Evening, everybody. So tonight our study is going to be a little bit long, so we're just going to get straight into it without any preliminaries here. But we've been looking at the third person of the Dark Trinity, what we're calling the final Antichrist. And you have to ask yourself, why are we falling for the things that are going to lead to his power, or that are leading currently to his power? And why is it going to get worse? Well, simply put, we are a society that is composed primarily of weak people, and weak people create hard times. Cotton Mather said that religion brought forth prosperity, and the daughter consumed the mother. G. Michael Hopp said, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And this latter quote is from a post apocalyptic novel, but the principle has repeated itself throughout history. In the Bible, we see it play out in Israel over and over again. In the Western civilization, uh, our civilization was built upon biblical principles, it was built upon religion. And the United States foundation was specifically Christianity. We didn't have to do it, but we chose to do it. But even then, there were those at the time that were waiting to conquer and to destroy that culture. Now, it was an imperfect Christianity. It was, after all, created by men, but it was Christianity. Now, religion brought forth prosperity out of hard times. The hard times created strong men. And even those who were not Christians believed in biblical principles as being necessary to the foundation of a prosperous society. Now, those strong men, they created the foundation for good times. They fought against enemies and they set down moral principles for success. As the tongue in cheek description goes, Americans will cross a frozen river to kill you in your sleep on Christmas. Not kidding, we've done it before. Those were strong men. They were fighting a superior army for the sake of liberty, and that liberty created good times. And those good times created weak men who were either unwilling or unable to withstand future tyranny, and that created hard times. And then the cycle began again, and now we're back to the hard times that are coming. But how did this happen? Why are we falling for it? And there's a number of reasons, but we're blind to them because we as a society, we don't read and we don't know the Bible. Matthew chapter 16, verse 1 through 3. The Pharisees also with the Sadducees came and tempting desired him that he would show them a sign from heaven. He answered and said unto them, when it is evening, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning it will be foul weather today, for the sky is red and lowering. O you hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky, but can you not discern the signs of the times? Well, if we knew the Bible, and at one point in time our culture did, but if we knew the Bible, we could see the decline of masculinity, the decline of health, the decline of IQ, the departure of faith, and on and on and on down the line. These things are not only declining naturally, but they're under direct attack to further erode them. Masculinity is openly attacked. Anything masculine is labeled as toxic. And the solution that they have is to feminize our boys so that they will not become men. And the attack on health is multifaceted, but the two most common avenues of attack are positive body image and an actual promotion of poor health. And at its root, a positive body image is a good thing. We're all made differently. You should feel comfortable in your own skin, as they say. But is your nose bigger than you'd like, or are you too tall or too short? Your skin color is not right, your build, you're too skinny, whatever it is. Well, those are things that you can't control, and there's nothing wrong with those things. However, what that concept has devolved into are things such as saying that morbid obesity is okay, and you should have a positive body image about that and not try to change it. And if you're too fat, and enjoy it and have another piece of cake because you only live once, right? If you try to do something about that, then they're going to say, oh, you just work out because of vanity. You know, you have to accept what is natural, but you have to fix what is unnatural. And interestingly, they have now determined that being obsessively healthy is a mental health problem, and they've given it a name, orthorexia nervosa. And it seems to me that if somebody is obsessed about being healthy, that would not be a bad thing. But they're trying to stop people from being healthy, saying that it's a mental illness. But our culture also promotes poor health in other ways. Some of those ways are unintentional and some are intentional. Some can be fixed, some can't be fixed, at least not by individuals. They call this health risk promotion, and it occurs when environments, policies, or behaviors create conditions that negatively impact health. Unhealthy environments is an example. Areas with high pollution or unsafe housing. We looked at the plastic situation in certain areas a while back. However, now it's becoming a problem in other nations due to unrestricted mass immigration of people from areas where this is a problem. They bring their bad behaviors with them, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. People have a lack of access to clean water. They have limited access to nutrition food options. Some nations don't have enough food for various reasons, but even in the United States, healthy food is much more expensive than unhealthy food, either because it's cheaper to produce unhealthy food or there are subsidies for them. We subsidize sugar, we don't subsidize good stuff. And of course, some people choose to buy the unhealthy food because it tastes better or because they spend their extra money on frivolities like game consoles. But a lack of food leads to hunger. Unhealthy food leads to obesity and other related diseases. And in some ways, being hungry is healthier as long as it's not a starvation type of situation. Philippians 3:18 through 19 says, For many walk, of whom I've told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who mind earthly things. Now, the Bible does tell us to feed the poor, primarily through leaving the corners of the fields unharvested so that the poor can work to feed themselves. It prevents hunger, but with dignity. But the Bible also warns against gluttony. We need to help those who are truly poor, but we don't need to be gluttons ourselves. And I would argue that filling yourself with junk food continually is a form of gluttony. People who do that, their God is their belly. And what have we seen about false gods? Now, when you worship false gods, you may get short term earthly satisfaction, but long term negative consequences. The word gluttony itself also encompasses things of a sexual nature. Some translations translate the Hebrew word as whoremonger. So you have spiritual, physical, hunger. It's all applied into the same word here. So here, this passage says that their end is destruction. They're perishing. They're going to lose what they expect to have. Their glory is their shame. We see that going on in the world today. We have pride parades where they glory in their shame. And I actually have a funny story about that. There's a dear friend of mine who moved to the United States from India back in the 1970s. And at that point in time, because of his culture, the way things are there, obesity was a sign of prosperity. And most people in India were hungry, but if you had enough money to become obese, if you were a glutton, that means that you were very financially prosperous. So pretty soon after moving here, he met a woman, and thinking it was a compliment, gleefully said to her, "Oh, you are so fat." He also said, "I quickly learned to never say that again in the United States because it was not a compliment here." But we glory in our belly, things that we shouldn't be glorying in. That's what we praise. They glory in their shame. They mind earthly things. Their focus is on temporal things, and they're going to end up with nothing but destruction. They're going to perish. And perishing doesn't mean a loss of being in the family of God, but it has to do with a loss of rewards in the coming kingdom, or even repercussions here on earth sometimes. Hosea 4:6 says, My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee, that thou shalt be no priest to me. Seeing thou hast forgotten the law of thy God, I will also forget thy children. Just as with spiritual things, this applies to earthly things as well. Poor health is promoted through lack of education. Some people don't care about health risks, but most people are ignorant of health risks, about things such as poor diet, sedentary behavior, or even smoking. Some people don't even realize that smoking is bad for you. And sometimes people know these things, or they should know, but they don't believe those things. And then that adds an extra dimension into this. And it's also applicable to spiritual things as well. Now, the earthly and the spiritual are connected. Just as some people are unaware of or don't believe things about poor health, they're also unaware of or they don't believe things about poor spiritual health. Recently, I was reading about a so called Christian witch. And first of all, I want to say there's no such thing. The word Christian defines somebody who's living a life of Christ, and you can't be a practicing witch and live a Christian life. But it's ignorance, either not knowing or not believing. But it's ignorance of spiritual things that can lead to this. Often, somebody who is sick spiritually is also sick physically, and somebody who is sick physically is sick spiritually. It goes back and forth. There are also some people who are mentally ill, which affects the physical. Don't assume that every manifestation of mental issues is demonic. By the same token, don't assume that there's no such thing as demonic manifestations. But you have lukewarm preachers, you have false teachers, and they all add to this problem spiritually. And then you have influencers who promote health ideas that are false that amplifies a physical problem. Promoting poor health, either physically or spiritually, can have significant and dire consequences on the entire culture. Physically, there are more chronic diseases that keep us sick, but there's also higher healthcare costs, which increases poverty, all of which reduces the quality of life. And addressing these factors with truth would improve the situation, but people hate the truth. Truth is hard. Most people prefer easy lies to hard truths, but somebody's always going to come along and say, I can fix the problem with no hardship if you just give me power. So why are we falling for it? Because weak people create hard times. We looked at health making people weak, but what about IQ? What about mental ability? How is that important and how does that apply to being weak? What happens when somebody has a low IQ? The those who are on the left politically, they call themselves progressive most of the time here in the United States now, but they try to push the idea that fundamentally everybody's the same, and all we have to do is take money from those who produce and give it to those who have no money, and it's going to fix education. After all, to them, educational resources are not properly distributed, and if we can fix that, well, then everybody can succeed. And while education may be necessary to success, not necessarily institutional education, as history has shown, but not everybody can benefit from education. The other side says that somebody who is unsuccessful is just lazy and needs to get a job. And that may be true in many cases, but there are many cases that that's not true. There's not a job out there for everybody. And the exception is not the rule, but the exception is important. In the United States, it's illegal to induct anybody into the military if they have an IQ that is lower than 83. Verbal IQ specifically has to do with an individual's ability to use and understand language, things such as vocabulary, comprehension, reasoning, things like that. But this refusal to accept them into the military is not simply discrimination, there's a good reason for it. The United States military has been researching IQ for more than a century because they needed a way to separate people quickly during times of emergency. But also, they were trying to identify the deserving poor who could benefit from additional education. If they could identify people from the lower classes who could be channeled into officer training programs or technical programs, well, then they could be moved from the underclass to the working class, maybe even higher. This concept was important to combat readiness, and in order to find people, they had to sort them out. They use IQ to do that. They needed to win wars, but the side effect would be that this would benefit society. That's what they thought. Well, what they discovered was that anybody with an IQ lower than 83 was absolutely useless in the military. In the 1960s, due to an increase in pressure for numbers of the draft, a program was instituted for those with IQs lower than 83. It was officially known as Project 100,000, although 354,000 were using the program, but it was also known as McNamara's Folly, McNamara's Morons, and McNamara's Misfits. Even in the 60s, this was controversial, but what they did was they recruited soldiers that didn't meet mental or physical standards such as IQ or being overweight. They started the program in October of 1966, and it was started by Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, who thought that he could use technology to raise IQ. And in order to meet the increased workforce requirements that were necessitated by the Vietnam War, they needed these extra people. Well, those who were within the program died at 3 times the rate of other Americans. And after their service, they had lower incomes and higher rates of divorce than their non veteran counterparts. In other words, not only did it not help them, it made them worse off. And this disastrous program was ended in 1971. So those with an IQ lower than 83 were absolutely useless. Anybody with an IQ lower than 83 could not be transformed into somebody who could do something productive, and they were usually counterproductive. And this is about 10% of the population, which is kind of depressing to think about. But the military has a history of taking poor people and pushing them into success. And in wartime, and sometimes in peacetime, they're pretty desperate for recruits. But a full 10% of the population cannot be trained to do anything useful enough to be used in the military. Well, there's a company called Wonderlic that has developed an IQ test for the commercial perspective, and it links IQ levels to job category abilities. Today, even service jobs require a lot of high levels of abilities to interact with complex technology like computers and things like that. Even many jobs that would be considered lower end jobs, like working a cash register at a fast food restaurant, there's a need to be able to operate fairly complicated machines that is beyond the ability of people who are on the low end of the intelligence distribution. Earl B. Hunt was a psychologist who specialized in both human and artificial intelligence, and he demonstrated that with an IQ below 90, it's difficult to read well enough to put what somebody reads into action, such as reading an instruction manual and putting it into action. And if any scientist actually studies IQ issues, it's always criticized and condemned. In 1996, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein wrote a 916-page book called The Bell Curve. And in the book, they gave overwhelming evidence that IQ is both environmental and genetic, and is the greatest predictor of future success. And their viewpoint is from a free market society, or at least a semi-free market, but would not apply to tyrannical societies that disappoint people. But this book was immediately attacked by everybody who had not read the book. They didn't like the ideas that were proven. But the book showed that the typically educated person thinks that somebody is not too bright if they have an IQ of 115, even if they have a graduate level degree. And remember, 100 is average. But there are as many people at 150 and above as there are at 85 and below, and it's a small minority of people in either group. Those who have an IQ below 83, it's almost impossible to train them for a job, and there are very few jobs available for them, and there's not much that can be done about it, which makes it hard to kind of help the poor. But that's why people hate intelligence research. It reveals truth. It reveals facts about the range of abilities between human beings. We're all equal in the eyes of God, and we should all be equal in the eyes of the law, but we're not all equal in abilities, no matter how much time and money is thrown at the issue. And people hate the truth. Always remember that. And remember, there's also 3 kinds of truth. There's abstract truth, which you think about, reality truth, which is the way things are, and then opinion truth, which is what you want them to be. Well, this research uses reality truth, and the world prefers opinion truth. People who are on the low end of cognitive abilities that have a decreasing ability to survive in an increasingly complex and sophisticated environment because the jobs require higher cognitive abilities, even for lower end jobs. And those lower end jobs are disappearing. We no longer need people to dig ditches because we have machines for that. And even things like mowing yards, we're no longer going to need people for that because we have robotic lawnmowers to do it. So those jobs are going away. But somebody always comes along and promises a painless and effortless solution, and people are weak and they buy into those promises. The deceiver sets up the situation, the seductress weakens people, and the destroyer will conquer the people through that deception, and the people will be conquered through voluntary submission. Always remember, the final Antichrist will conquer through peace. Galatians 6:7 says, "Be not deceived. God is not mocked. For whatsoever a man sows, that shall he also reap." In 2 Timothy 3:13, but evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. We're being deceived. We're falling for it because weak people have created hard times. Health, both physical and spiritual, it's abominable. IQ for the first time in decades is dropping, and in some cases dropping dramatically. And while the average IQ is just a little lower, the outliers are much lower. And all of this comes about through the destruction of masculinity. Men have been called to a biblical manhood. Masculinity and femininity are both necessary to a healthy society, and our current culture is destroying both. It's passively destroying femininity through neo-feminism. There's nothing wrong with true feminism, but what is presented today is not feminism. It's destructive, but masculinity is under direct assault. Anything masculine is called toxic, and originally toxic masculinity had a very narrow definition. But like all things from the certain political spectrum, the definition has shifted to mean that anything masculine is toxic. And they'll tell you that a man who thinks he is a woman is born that way and can't help it. But a man who is manly was molded that way by society and needs to be changed. In other words, somebody who's actually a man they want to change, but somebody who's not a man that pretends, well, that's okay. Our problem, however, is not so-called toxic masculinity, but it's a complete lack of masculinity, or at least a terrible deficit of masculinity. There are still some shining examples out there, but they're becoming fewer and fewer. We see fathers who are passive, which passes this lack of masculinity down through the generations. If you go all the way back to Abraham, we see him get a little passive and he lets his wives fight and has all kinds of issues. And I have to admit that if I had more than one wife, I'm not sure I'd be any better. And it's a good thing that I only have one. But before that, all the way back at the beginning, we have Adam, the very beginning of the human race. What happened with Adam? Well, you have the serpent that shows up, and Eve listens to the serpent. And what does Adam do? Nothing. He didn't correct the behavior. He didn't reprove the behavior. He didn't even offer a solution to the behavior. Genesis 3:6 says, and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. The Bible shows us that men need to be active. They don't need to be not domineering or bullying or anything like that. That's not masculinity. Being overbearing is not masculinity, it's tyranny. But men need to be men. Men are made for action. There's actually seems to be a gene for action that's built into our bodies. Men are made for combat if necessary. Men make things and they build things and they make more. They make war when they're attacked. And any man who is passive is not willing to lead his family in a biblical manner. And what's the result of that? We see examples of that all through the Bible. We saw Ahab. When Adam doesn't lead, Satan does what he does best. He destroys. When Jacob got passive, had 11 brothers got angry and aggressive, and they allied together and they make choices that are not healthy. They're dysfunctional choices. They're not led by the father. They were like German shepherds who had not been trained. They're brave and they're strong, but without the masculine guidance of the father, they committed an atrocity and they compiled problem upon problem. And of course, as we know, God used it for his glory, but their actions were simply wrong. Now, these brothers in Genesis 34, they have a sister named Dinah. She goes out and was raped. And what did the father do? Nothing. That's passive. He did absolutely nothing. So the brothers went out into the town where she was raped. They created a situation in which the men in town were vulnerable. And then Simeon and Levi killed every single man. That may or may not have been the right response, but it's not passive. Ideally, the father, instead of being passive, would have led a course of action and said, sons, okay, here's what we're going to do. But he didn't do that. He would have said that, and then they would have gone and done something. Probably something a little bit less drastic than killing everybody, but they would have gone out and done something. But his passiveness led to an unhealthy aggression of his children. And we see this unhealthy aggression more and more every day. We see it. I was watching the clips from a football game the other day where you're supposed to be aggressive, but it turned into an unhealthy aggression by some who failed to achieve what they should. So instead of being aggressive in the sport, they got violent and tried to actually injure people. Um, these young men with unhealthy aggression, they come out of homes where they're tired of nothing happening. They have a passive father or an absent father, most likely, but they're going to do something instead of nothing. And sometimes you can be impassive in some areas and active in others, so it's not an all or nothing situation. You may be aggressive and coach your sons at baseball, but ignore teaching your daughter how she should be treated by a man. While it's better to be active in only some areas than being active in no areas, ideally, as a man, you should be masculine in all areas. And I don't always succeed, but I try to teach my granddaughters to be both delicate and tough as nails at the same time. I try to teach my grandsons to be tough in all things, but delicate if the situation calls for it. I'm going to read a story here in Genesis chapter 37. We're going to read verses 12 through 14 and verse 18. And his brethren went to feed their flock in Shechem. And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I. And he said to him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren and well with the flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now remember, Shechem is where Dinah was raped and they killed all the men, so it's almost like returning to the scene of a crime. And then he ran into a guy who told him where they were, and he went after his brethren. And then when the brethren saw him from afar off, even before he came near unto him, they conspired against him to slay him. And they said one to another, Behold, this dreamer cometh. Come now, therefore, and let us slay him, and cast him into some pit. We will say, Some evil beast hath devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it, and he delivered him out of their hands, and said, Let us not kill him. And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver him to his father again. So at least Reuben's trying to do something here, even if it was somewhat passive. But if you continue reading this story, you see that his plans fail because he was not there when he came back. They decided to sell it. And it came to pass when Joseph was come into his brethren that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. And they took him and cast him into a pit, and the pit was empty. There was no water in it. And they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother in our flesh. And his brethren were content. That's brotherly love right there. Hey, we'll sell him as a slave instead of killing him. But then there passed by Midianite merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. So the father sent Joseph to check on his brothers while they were working. What was Joseph working? Apparently, he was not working. They were doing hard labor, but as a favorite son, he stayed home, and then he was sent to check on them. He was a supervisor without putting in the work. He was told to go check on them and then come back and report to dad. He was told to be a tattletale, and nobody likes a tattletale. Now, excuse me, although Reuben did try to save Joseph, he doesn't have a lot of authority. He didn't have a lot of authority because he slept with one of his father's concubines. Now, concubines had a recognized relationship with the man, with rights just like wives, but was the lower status than a wife and was often subservient to the wife. And although Reuben was not related to the concubine by blood, she was equivalent to being a wife of his father, and that relation is a big forbidden thing. It's a big no-no in God's eyes on many levels. So Reuben had lost his moral authority, and sexual sins will cause you to lose moral authority. Do we see that in society today? I know back when I was growing up, they still say it today. If it feels good, do it. Also, once a single guy sleeps with a woman, he's already surrendered to her and she's in control. There's a proper order to things. First, you get married, then you have intercourse with her. And we're all humans and we fall short. So if you fall short in this area, you're going to have some morality building to do, but it doesn't mean that all is lost, but you have to work to fix the things. And this is one reason that premarital sex leads to higher divorce rates. There are certain expectations going in that change once you get married. And we no longer raise our children to be married. Society says that spouses are disposable. Well, if things aren't perfect and you're not perfectly satisfied, you can always trade him or her in for a newer model. Far too many marriage counselors teach that marriage is a 50-50 proposition. Problem with that is it's a 100-100 proposition. You both have to put in 100%. And if in your mind, if you even remotely think that divorce is an option, then the odds increase drastically that you will get divorced. You graduate school, you get a job, then you get married, then you have children. That's the equation to a successful life. And when men change that order, they lose the moral authority to lead. So in our story, Reuben could have been the one to resolve the crisis. And it doesn't work out the way he planned. He did try. He said, hey, let's not murder him. I have a plan. And the other brothers are like, well, we didn't listen to dear old dad, and we don't listen to you either, you pervert. But men and women, you need to use your brain and not your hormones in life. God gave us a brain for a reason, and that reason he gave us the instruction manual, the Bible to follow. And if you follow your emotions instead of following your brain and what it says in the Bible, if you follow your emotions, you're going to be in for a world of hurt. And if you don't have control of your own desires, it's not what you hate that's going to destroy you, but it's what you enjoy that will destroy you. Thankfully, sometimes God lets us do a reset. And I praise God for that. That doesn't mean that you can do it on purpose expecting a future reset. That's called lawlessness, and that's a special subject, and it's treated very harshly in the Bible. Lawlessness is doing what's right in one's own eyes. But sometimes God does let us do a reset. So Reuben rescued Joseph from being murdered. He intended to come back later and restore him to their father, but they took him, and before throwing him into the pit, they stripped him of the coat of many colors, which was a sign of the favoritism by the father. And then they threw him into this empty pit. There's no water, no bathroom, just a big hole in the ground. They lowered down some food to him, and then they saw a bunch of Ishmaelites, and Judah convinced his brothers to sell Joseph into bondage. Now, the Ishmaelites are going to be important later when we get to Psalm 82 and Obadiah. But this particular group of Ishmaelites specialized in slaves, among a few other things. And if you read the book of Jasher, it's a lot more involved in that. They realized that they were involved in something they shouldn't be, so they sold him to some other slave traders without a profit in order to get him off their hands. Then the new slave traders took Joseph and sold him for 400 pieces of silver. So the going rate for a slave was 20 pieces of silver, so Joseph was something special. But the brothers pulled him out of the pit. They sold him for 20 pieces of silver, and the traders took him to Egypt, and they sold him to Potiphar. Now, Joseph had been being a bit of a jerk. He got the special coat, and then went out to bring back a report on his brothers who were actually doing the work. But the punishment doesn't actually fit the crime. Excuse me. Sometimes when a spoiled brat gets his comeuppance, you may smile inwardly, but being sold into slavery it's a bit much for that. So what they viewed as justice was actually vengeance. Romans 12:19 from the NET Bible says, "Do not avenge yourselves, dear friends, but give place to God's wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." This is quoted from Deuteronomy 32:35, by the way. So there's a lot more to this story, but this is the part that's relevant right now. This passive father created a situation that was really messed up. He had multiple wives. He played favorites. When his daughter was raped, he did nothing. And so the brothers took matters into their own hands without fatherly guidance. And the result is that the younger brother was sold into slavery, where he probably didn't even know the language. And then he ended up saving them all. And this is truly a dysfunctional family situation. And it had a good result in spite of this dysfunction. God works through whatever means he chooses. He wants obedience. But when people are disobedient, he can still use that. And this doesn't mean to go out and intentionally do evil just because God can use it. You're still expected to be obedient. But if you fail, God can still use you. Sin does a lot of damage. Adam and Eve turned on each other. Cain slew Abel. The sons of Jacob sold Joseph into bondage and on, all through the Bible. The Bible's full of stories that warn us against bad behavior. Modern pop psychology teaches to be positive and not negative. And Bible translators and preachers often fall under that spell and they fail to warn people. God does promise us great rewards for obedience, but he spends a lot more time warning us against what's going to happen if we're disobedient. And a lack of Bible knowledge and a lack of obedience to biblical morals has put Western culture in a bad place. And we've looked briefly at the decline of masculinity, the decline of health, and the decline of IQ, but the departure of faith is probably the most devastating thing that's affecting us. It's the nail in the coffin, or maybe it is the coffin, in which Western civilization will be buried. And look at the culture around us. If you live anywhere in the Western world, there's a rising tax burdens. And remember, God said that 10% is enough for him, and he warned that a king might want the same amount. We've gone to a point that's many times that 10%. We have economic stagnation, political corruption. Think to Ephesians 6:12. Uh, Moral disorientation. People no longer know right from wrong. We have drug addiction, skyrocketing poverty rates. Homelessness is epidemic. Lawlessness abounds, and our entire civilization is crumbling and collapsing around us. Matthew 24:12 says, and because iniquity or because lawlessness shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. The West is falling, and most people are blind as to why it's falling. Some see the collapse of morality and Christian religion in general, but most people see the rise of consumerism and hedonism, which are symptoms more than causes. Some people see the dumbing down of society due to modern technology, but then they fail to see that that's only one piece of the puzzle. Mass immigration is a problem because of the source of the immigration. Socialist ideologies are brought in from other failed socialist regimes. Some blame the mainstream media, and they are culpable, but they're not the source of the problem. The reality is the spiritual and the physical are inseparable. We're both morally sick and physically sick. Our society is weak and it's ripe for the picking. And many people do see the spiritual aspect, although they misdiagnose the source, but they fail to see the physical. And when the physical is pointed out to them, while you're just phobic against whatever truth you're exposing. We're not smarter than ancient people were, but we're more sophisticated. We have built knowledge upon knowledge. We have a lot to add to it. The Greeks were not too stupid to send man to the moon, but the technological sophistication was not there. And that technological sophistication is what is helping to undo our civilization as well. And what does that mean? For all of our sophistication, we're simply biological animals, and the body is the foundation of the human world. And you say, oh, brother, we're not animals, we're men. Well, we are men. But the Bible tells us that both animals and men have a body, spirit, and soul. The main distinction is that man has a God-breathed spirit. Ancient rabbis taught that God took a living being, breathed the breath of life into him, and that's when he became a human being. And this was centuries before Darwin, so they weren't trying to appease science. What they were teaching is what they saw in the Bible, and it was the opposite of what science said at the time. They were going out on a limb opposing science when they said that. And their tradition, they saw that in the Bible. Their tradition is that he was probably about 40 years old because he was mature and ready to fulfill the role that God had for him. But like I said, that part is just simply tradition. And before you ask, where does the Bible teach that? I want to show you. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verses 18 through 21. I'm taking this from the Concordant Literal Version because they translate it concordantly. It's the same. I said in my heart, it is on account of the sons of humanity that the one, Elohim, seeks to manifest them and to show them that they themselves are beasts. For the destiny of the sons of humanity and the destiny of the beast is one destiny for them. As death is for this one, so is death for that one. And one spirit is for all. There is no advantage for the human over the beast, for the whole is vanity. All are going to one place. All have come from the soil, and all return to the soil. Who is knowing about the spirit of the sons of humanity, whether it's ascending above, and the spirit of the beast, whether it is descending below to the earth? The King James Version chose to translate this word as breath in one place and spirit in another. The word could mean either. However, in context, it should be translated consistently in this passage. And in verse 21, breath would make no sense at all. Therefore, it should be spirit in both verses 19 and 21. Genesis chapter 1 verse 24. And saying is the Elohim, bring forth shall the earth the living soul for its from kind, beast and moving animal, and land life for its own from kind, and coming is it to be so. It's a living soul. Once again, the King James chose to translate it differently, generally as creature. The literal meaning, they did that because the literal meaning meant something they didn't like. They were trying to distance the passage from what's being stated. And this same idea is also stated in verses 29, 21, 39, chapter 2, verse 7, verse 19, chapter 9, verse 12, 15, and 16. Then Genesis 7:22. This is from the stone Chumash, which is these are the Hebrew Torah that most Messianic Jews use. It says, all in whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, of everything that was on dry land died. The spirit of life. It's the breath of the spirit of life. This is the Orthodox Jewish text, but it is what the Messianic Jews use, the believers in Jesus. And why most English translations, and there are a few exceptions, they change the spirit of the breath of life simply to the breath of life. And I'm not certain why, except it seems to be a way of trying to distance man from animals. And I want us to look at it as it's written. And as we can see, animals have a body, a soul, and a spirit. Genesis 2:7. And the Lord Yahweh, God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of the spirit of life, and man became a living soul. The King James Version decided to translate spirit as breath, but got the rest correct here. Some translations translate spirit correctly, but not soul. Others get soul correct, but not spirit. The point is, the body plus the spirit plus the soul is what man consists of, and the body plus the spirit makes the soul. 1 Thessalonians 5:23, and the very God of peace sanctify you wholly. And I pray God your whole spirit and soul and body be preserved blameless into the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, I've heard many preachers preach that man is a body plus a spirit or soul, a life force, which is the same thing that natural evolutionists teach. They teach that man is a dichotomous being, a two-part being. God tells us that man is a three-part being, a trichotomous being, just as God is a three-part being. Animals are also a three-part being. While we're the same, we're also different. 1 Corinthians 15:39 says, all flesh is not the same flesh, but there's one kind of flesh of men, another flesh of beasts, another of fishes, and another of birds. In other words, both humans and animals are three-part beings, but this does not prove that natural evolution is true because while we're the same, we're also different. And we've looked at this before while studying the Nephilim and how they mixed human DNA with animal DNA to get chimera hybrids. And we're doing that again today through technological sophistication. We are biological animals, but we're spiritual beings. And the body is the foundation of the human world. Every value and every invention, every thought we form is influenced by our physical biology. And if our physical biology deteriorates, with Ephesians 6:12 in mind, politics is derived from culture, and our culture derives from biology, and our physical biology, our strength, our masculinity, our IQ, our obesity, hormonal imbalances, things like that. If those things deteriorate, then our entire culture deteriorates. Then our politics deteriorate, and we're captive to the enemy. Satan will win until God steps in. And if you look around you, you can see that changing things in a person's body can make people behave and think differently. If some change happens to many or most of the citizens, then there could be a collective IQ drop or a collective increase in obesity, and the entire culture would behave differently. If the people are not the same, then the society would not be the same. And in the past few years, people have changed their bodies, and our entire society has changed. Now, one example of a cultural change is the average IQ drop in the 20th century due to leaded gasoline. And this is only one example. It may not even be the primary, but there are many other causes, some in the 21st century. But most people are blind to them. In the 20th century, a scientist named Thomas Migley Jr. came up with the idea to put lead into gasoline in order to stop engine knocking. Well, it stopped the knocking, but the lead in the air affected people physically, and the average IQ dropped measurably among certain groups and nations where leaded gasoline was used. Also, people with a high IQ tend to be ADHD, or they tend to be on the autism scale, and then they want to cure that, which makes people dumber. When the authorities correct that, it fixes the ADHD, but it lowers the IQ of those individuals. And this subject itself is deserving of a longer and deeper study, but not here and not now. There are some people who have a low IQ and they realize it, and it's kind of gut wrenching. Often they were high IQ people who, through injury or illness, they damaged their brains and now they have a lower IQ. They often know what it was like before and they can compare it to now. Some are simply low IQ people and they're aware that their IQ is lower and then it's a burden to them. And I want us to look at the IQ just a little bit further here, real quick. The decline in IQ is one of the signs pointing to the biological decline in the West. In spite of the problem with the leaded gasoline, worldwide IQ did rise steadily from 1909 until 2013 by 2 complete standard deviations. And this rise led to the tremendous innovation in the 20th century in technology, science, and especially in industry. But in the early 21st century, this trend stopped and then reversed. The new generation was dumber than their parents' generations. The prosperous Western nations experienced a serious IQ drop that started just after the turn of the century. Most non-Western countries, however, they continued to increase their IQ. Now, while some of this can be attributed to lower IQ people moving to Western nations, most of it can be attributed to other things. For example, marijuana use. Sorcery in the Bible, remember, is drug use. But marijuana use was increased from 4% in 1970 to 22% in 2024, with the daily use being 10 times higher than it was in the early 1970s. Not just a little bit, 10 times. That was the hippie days. It was known for drug use. But it's so casual now that it's more prevalent and nobody notices. Also, the marijuana today has been genetically modified in a way that is much more potent and can actually cause psychotic breaks, among other negative effects that generally didn't happen in the past. Daily marijuana use is now higher than daily alcohol use for the first time in history. And this is not talking about casual alcohol use with like a couple of beers with dinner, but talking about people drinking to get drunk, using it as an intoxicant. Marijuana use is now more prevalent than that. And regular use of marijuana leads to a permanent lowering of adult IQ values. And the younger kids are, when they start, the greater the correlation with intelligence and adulthood. And you have these parents out there now starting their own kids, starting smoking marijuana when they're 8, 9 years old, and it harms them for life. Pesticide usage also correlates with lowering of IQ. Children who live within 5 miles of farms that use pesticides have an IQ that is 2.6 points lower. But these pesticides are also found in residues in food and food products, so even those who don't live close to farms are still affected. Spending hours per day glued to a smartphone or tablet while consuming short form content contributes to the dumbing down of the West, as well as contributing to shorter attention spans. And the long term effect is much greater among children and infants. This screen time also corresponds to lower levels of physical activity, which leads to worse health and actually hinders the neurocognitive development in children. In the 1970s, only about 15% of American adults were obese. Today, 43% are obese and 74% are overweight. And among children, it has risen from 4.2 to 16.9%, and it will usually affect them for the rest of their lives. When you have a child that's obese, they're almost always adults that are obese. But excess body fat impairs intelligence and it impairs cognitive function. Basically, Westerners are getting dumber because we're fatter than ever. Multiple studies have shown that this is more than a simple correlation, it is a causation. Obesity also suppresses testosterone production, as well as endocrine disrupting chemicals found in plastics, which has gotten into our food supply and even into our tap water. And this is another sign of the biology of Westerners deteriorating. The average testosterone level has fallen by 30 to 50% in just 2 generations. Cultures where obesity and endocrine disruptors are not present has a much lower rate of decline. A 30-year-old today has a lower testosterone level than a 60-year-old had 30 years ago. Age is a factor, but young people have lower levels than older people did in the previous generation. 20 or 30 years difference here. Testosterone is not simply about aggression and reproduction, but it increases bone density and muscular strength, as well as mood, focus, resilience, competitiveness, and it decreases sensitivity to pain and fatigue. It's the biological basis for energy, confidence, drive, and purpose. Colossians 3:23 says, "And whatsoever you do it heartily as to the Lord and not unto men." James 1, verses 2 through 4. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith works patience, but let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. Then James 1:12. Blessed is the man that endures temptation, or that endures testing. For when he is tried, he shall receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to them that love him. We're to work for God. And if we've destroyed our drive and energy, we're crippling ourselves. We have to work that much harder if we're to be successful. We don't work for our common salvation, but we work for rewards, and we have to withstand testing if we're to receive the crown of the life. This is life in the coming kingdom age. This has to do with rewards. And we've been promised great things for being faithful, but masculinity has been destroyed both culturally and physically, so people are not performing their proper roles. And mankind has done it to himself, not as individuals perhaps, but as a whole, and it's not an accident. These things didn't happen by accident. As testosterone levels have fallen, so has fertility. And although the world is still very overpopulated and the population is still rising right now, the sperm counts have declined in the West by more than half since 1970. They're anticipating a precipitous population drop in the next few years. In Western countries, the birth rates have already fallen below replacement levels. Some is by choice of being responsible, but some is by inability. However, the nations that are driving the population growth are mostly in the least advanced, least healthy, and lowest IQ places. Due to cousin inbreeding, Muslim nations have some of the lowest IQ levels in the world, and there's a link below to nations in the world and their IQ levels. And this is something to consider when looking at the conditions in their own countries, as well as the results of their mass migration to other nations, such as Somalians in the United States, and all the problems in the United Kingdom and in other European nations that have taken in an unsustainable number of migrants from these countries. But low testosterone levels are related to the crisis of masculinity and to the scarcity of real men. There's no more heroic manhood, or very little of it. Compare hero movies of the past with the present, and then compare heroes in the past and reality to heroes in the present. Healthy men build, they protect, they defend important values, they uphold important things in society, they take principled risk, and they show resilience in the face of hardships. I recently saw a closed circuit TV footage of a robbery in which a man and a woman, presumably not husband and wife anymore, but they were together, they were a couple, they were robbed at knife point. And the man, instead of defending his woman, he actually ran away. And this is what our culture has become. But with low testosterone levels, things change. Men become both physically and emotionally fragile, crying and weeping all the time. They're apathetic. They're obsessed with safety. Uh, they want to wear a helmet when they go for a walk, things like that. But they're almost pathologically risk averse. They're obsessively dependent on external authorities to guide, protect, and provide. And sometimes these authorities are parents. They never move out of their parents' basement. But usually they want bureaucrats to protect them. They want the state to protect them. They stay at home with their parents, they play video games, and they live in a listless existence, and they drag others down with them. They're sissy men. They're weepy-eyed snowflakes. And this sissification of men is why there is such a rise in support for woke causes. Now, the term woke used to be a term that meant you were aware of social issues and injustices. However, over time, it has evolved to mean that you were supportive of progressive causes, no matter how radical, and in search of equal outcome instead of equal opportunity. In other words, race and sex become primary over merit. In other words, woke has come to represent political correctness and force at the barrel of a gun and government force. There's no longer a colorblind society. Now, the only thing that matters is color or sex or transgender or whatever pet ideology you have. That's the only thing that's important. But this has led to left-wing politics among those who should be strongest and most protective and most opposed to the nanny state. And it's not an accident. Satan knows that healthy men, knows that masculinity, along with their wives, the feminine, they can stop the evil. And so masculinity and healthy families, they have to be stopped. Masculinity, along with a catastrophic drop in IQ. Weak men have empowered authoritarian governments to protect them. As IQ and masculinity has declined, they don't care about political corruption and governmental overreach. They just simply accept state propaganda and simplistic narratives in exchange for protection. They're no longer the protectors, and they're literally wards of the state. They've created an intellectually dull society that embraces totalitarianism. Just simply look at the response to the government mandated agenda surrounding the COVID situation. They turned a bad cold into the most overreaching government in history, all in exchange for protection. And scientists have found a correlation between citizens who are more intelligent and a more open and corruption free government. Lower intelligence shows less interest in democratic value and favoring a simplistic tyranny that makes great promises of prosperity and safety. Those who are lower intelligence exchange liberty for a false peace. And the Bible tells us that this is what happens. This is what's going to happen. And remember, the final Antichrist will conquer through peace. It won't conquer through warfare or anything such as that. The people will simply give him power and control, and then it'll be too late. And as masculinity disappears, as testosterone levels drop, as IQ plummets, Western society is ripe for the plucking. And Satan has somebody in place to do just that. As the psychologist William James pointed out, the ideal of a well-trained and vigorous body will be maintained neck by neck with that of the well-trained and vigorous mind as the two co-equal halves of the higher education of men and women alike. We have to be healthy both mentally and physically. And as individuals, we can do our part, or as much as we can, by eating less processed food, avoiding pesticides, avoiding products with a lot of chemicals, exercise regularly, sleep better. We can't be healthy physically or mentally if we're fat and weak. And while the entire society may not improve itself, we can improve as individuals. We can both think and do. We're commanded to do. More than 1,000 times in the New Testament, we're told to do something. If we're weak, we can't do. Most people today are simply passive. They want somebody to do for them, somebody to protect them. And this is what can cause a mother to offer her child as a sacrifice to Moloch, by whatever name you want to call it, the god of convenience. By doing this, people will become prosperous and their lives will be blessed. That's the way they look at it. This is sick and it's depraved. But today we're offering or we're sacrificing our children by the millions. Historically, people would vow that if the God blessed them, a new house, a good harvest, whatever it was they wanted, then they would sacrifice their child. Today, they sacrifice their child to prevent hardship for the mother, so the mother can advance her career, or so the mother can get an education by killing the child. These inconveniences are roadblocks to success, and they would be removed. Feminist leaders and celebrities boast that by killing their child, they had achieved success, and now you can do it too. Isaiah 49:15 says, "Can a woman forget her sucking child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? Yea, they may forget, yet will I not forget thee." And while many mothers later regret their decision, there are so many heartbreaking stories about mothers who made the wrong decision. Many of them regret it, but the answer to the question is yes, some mothers forget their child. And for those who made the wrong decision, God offers forgiveness. Acts 3:19, repent you therefore and be converted. Turn back, that your sins may be blotted out. They'll be erased entirely when the times of refreshing shall come from the presence of the Lord. For those who repent, there's forgiveness. They may not forget, but they have forgiveness. However, there are many who do forget, and that's our society today. That this is not natural. This goes against the most basic instinct in humans. This is the work of the false gods. In the past, the mother would give her child to the priest who was the officiant. Today, she gives it to the abortionist who's the officiant of the god itself, or Satan. In the past, the sacrifice was accompanied by music of celebration. Today, the mother who sacrifices her child is celebrated as if what she did was a work of something great. But psychologically, in the past, the music covered up the sounds of the child's torments and suffering. Today, there are laws that prevent you from showing the torment and suffering of an unborn baby to the mother-to-be. The state has to protect its blood sacrifice, after all. If you try to show it on a sign at an abortion clinic, you will be arrested. In the past, those who were wealthy, they didn't want to sacrifice their own flesh and blood, so they would purchase a baby from a poor mother and they would nurture it and take it as their own child, and then they would sacrifice that one. So poor children are much more likely to be sacrificed than wealthy children. And it's the same today. The children of those who are poor and minorities are aborted at a much higher rate than the wealthy. There are more black babies that are aborted than are born. And one of the attributes of Moloch is that he was racist and he hated the poor and the downtrodden. It's the same today. Those are the ones he wanted dead the most. And perhaps it's because it's easier to convince them to sacrifice their children. The false gods want blood. In ancient times, it was believed that child sacrifice benefited not only the individual, but it benefited the entire culture. In wars, droughts, plagues, and other disasters, there was mass child sacrifice to appease the gods. And think back to the Aztecs that we mentioned a few weeks back. They were going to kill 10,000 12-year-old girls in one day. Today's the same. Mass abortion is held as a public good. It benefits society because now the mother is free to further her career and become a slave to the state. The abortion industry also sells body parts. This is the perfect mixture of mixing blood with profit. This is a bloodlust for a culture that consumes itself. Form of cannibalism. The ancients viewed child sacrifice as something holy. I don't think it's any different today. While it's true that Satanists and other occultists openly view child sacrifice as a sacrament, modern day abortion is celebrated as something that is sacrosanct. They'll say, is it not marvelous what we're doing? It's a sacrifice of the God of secular humanism, the God of self, the God of convenience, and Satan is behind it all. The priests of Baal and Moloch spoke of child sacrifice in the most reverent of terms. Well, the priests today are the abortionists, but also the corporations that benefit from the blood sacrifice, and the political leaders who fight to make sure that there's plenty of blood sacrifice available. There are plenty of radical activists who lead the mothers to the altar to make their blood sacrifice. This is pure savagery. Our entire culture is savage. And it's not simply hyperbole. It's not my words. It is their words. Jeanette Paris, in the Sacrament of Abortion, said our culture needs new rituals as well as laws to restore abortion to its sacred dimensions. They call it a sacrament. It is not immoral to choose abortion. It is simply a different kind of morality, a pagan one. Sarah Terzo, an abortion is a sacrament and done for the love of the baby. Yeah, actually said that this is done for the love of the baby. Abortion is a major blessing and a sacrament in the hands of women. There are so many people out there who openly call abortion a sacrament, and a lot who act like it is, even if they don't say it. They treat it like it's a sacred act. And I don't need to really add anything else to what they say here. Their words speak for them. My opinion is not needed. They demonstrate that this is just pure savagery. Israel was condemned for turning to Moloch, the child sacrifice, and they were punished. Can we think that we're any different today? Western nations, they were all Christian nations at one point, but Western nations have turned from the one true God and they've turned to the false gods. They've turned to child sacrifice for the public good. Can society change? It probably could. We know that it won't. Society may not change, but individuals can find forgiveness and liberty. And I want to close with this verse again that we looked at earlier, Acts 3:19. Repent ye therefore and be converted. Turn back, that your sins may be blotted out, they may be erased entirely, when the times of refreshing shall come from the presence of the Lord. As an individual, no matter what sin you've committed, you can repent and you can turn back, and your sins will be as if they never existed. There's a new age coming, and we need to prepare for that coming age. And if you've not repented and turned back, I would ask you to do so now while it's still today. I'm praying for you, and I'll see you next week.